Chapter 5. Come the Bolsheviks. During Imperial Russia's last decades, Pavlov lived his vision of the good life. Most important was his science, the center of which was his large, bountifully funded and staffed physiology division at the Imperial Institute of Experimental Medicine, IEM. When he became professor of physiology at the Military Medical Academy in 1895, he acquired also Sion's former lab there. His Nobel Prize in 1904 soon brought election to Russia's elite Academy of Sciences and another small lab. The good life was purposeful, precise, and regular. Constantly moving with his swift stride, according to a strict schedule, unswervingly committed to his science, Pavlov was not only a charismatic and effective researcher and lab manager, but also the embodiment of energetic optimism and efficient industrial culture. His dynamic purposefulness was manifest in the daily and annual routines that he lived like clockwork, speeding by foot between venues, entering the Academy's lecture hall at precisely 9 o'clock and his IEM lab just as the cannon at the Peter and Paul Fortress announced the noon hour. Dinners began at 6 o'clock sharp, and the players of Durachki, a card game, who arrived Sunday evenings at his apartment, knocked on his door at precisely 9 o'clock. His annual schedule was equally pravilny. In early June, every year he boarded a train for his dacha, country home in Silomyagi, Estonia, where he remained until late August. Here, he adopted an unvarying, precise routine featuring gardening, swimming, and hotly competitive games of gorodki. Pavlov was a master of this traditional Russian sport that involves throwing a heavy bat at configurations of large wooden pins. Science was off limits. Pavlov read literature and philosophy, discussed art and music, and socialized with other members of the cultural elite, mostly artists, during months designed to compensate for the imbalances of urban professional life and restore harmony to mind and body. Pavlov described himself as a Russian liberal, but his support for the gradual evolution to a constitutional monarchy put him to the right of the constitutional Democrats, cadets, the Liberal Party popular with his colleagues. With rare exceptions, he had neither time nor inclination for political activities. Stung by Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904, he earned a black mark with the Tsarist secret police during the Revolution of 1905 for helping to organize an illegal union of professors. Shortly thereafter, he ran for the Duma as a candidate of the center-right Octoberist Party, receiving the most votes of that party's slate in his overwhelmingly cadet district, but failing to win a seat. Soon disillusioned with politics, he again, as one friend put it, shut himself off in his scientific research. His political ideology featured scientism and a fervent patriotism, with a deep romantic attachment to Russian life and nature, as portrayed by the art he collected, and identification with the strength and international stature of the Russian state. Yet, his patriotism coexisted with an uncomfortable conviction that, probably for historical reasons, the Russian type was inferior to the English and German. When the negative features of the Russian character, laziness, lack of enterprise, and even a slovenly approach to every vital work, provoke melancholy moods, he wrote in 1916, I say to myself, no, these are not our real qualities. They are only the damning inheritance of slavery. World War I aroused Pavlov's patriotism. He enthusiastically endorsed Russia's war aims and, with 2 sons at the front, followed the news avidly. As defeat turned to debacle, he scorned Tsar Nicholas II as an idiot and degenerate. Yet he scolded his liberal colleagues in the Cadet Party when they attempted to recruit him. "Don't you understand that you are committing a crime?" his wife recalled him saying, "arranging a revolution during wartime. This will lead to no good. No, I will never participate in the ruin of my homeland." The revolution of February 1917 and abdication of the Tsar left Pavlov extremely pessimistic. Yet he warmed to the Social Democratic Provisional Government's promise of expanded freedoms and support for science. Continued social disillusion and military defeats, however, soon confirmed his deepest fears. Revolution and Civil War, 1917 to 21. For Pavlov, at age 68, the Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917 and the long, bloody civil war that followed was a catastrophe that utterly destroyed his world. He talked constantly about the death of our homeland, recalled one close friend, and regarded the Bolsheviks with hostility and distrust. That hostility was fanned by growing anarchy and material privation, and by the Bolsheviks' nationalization of scientific institutions, granting of independence to parts of Imperial Russia's empire, and agreement to what Pavlov considered a dishonorable separate peace agreement with Germany. At the graveside of his best friend, artist Nikolai Dubovsky, who died of a heart attack shortly after the Reds occupied his hometown, he grieved for Russia as well. "I envy you. You no longer witness the ever-increasing destruction and disgrace of our homeland." Pavlov's circle was annihilated, and his family deeply scarred. The Pavlov's youngest son, Vsevolod, who had interrupted his studies toward a diplomatic career to serve as an officer at the front, informed his parents of the anarchistic hurricane devouring the army, and joined the White Resistance. Their favorite son, Victor, who combined his father's passion for science with his mother's religious faith, died of typhus on his way to join the Whites. Pavlov's brother, Sergei, a priest in Ryazan, was arrested by the Reds in 1919 and worked to death in a labor camp. The Bolshevik political police, Cheka, searched the Pavlov home several times and briefly detained both Pavlov and his eldest son, Vladimir. The Civil War produced disastrous living conditions in the Hungary capital, renamed Petrograd during the war, and the life of scientists grew extremely grim. The Bolshevik state, its survival hanging in the balance, wasted few resources on a scientific community that it considered, with good reason, politically hostile. From his spacious quarters at the Academy of Sciences residence, Pavlov witnessed the disastrous state of affairs for Russia's scholarly elite. 1/3 of his fellow academicians died. 2 perished of cold and hunger in apartments just above and below his own. Others watched helplessly as the communist authorities housed strangers in their quarters. Pavlov scavenged for firewood and fed his family from a garden he tended at the IEM. The Bolsheviks confiscated his Nobel Prize money. By 1918, lab work was grinding to a halt. Assistants were in short supply, and the dogs starved. As they did so, they served for experiments on the effect of starvation on conditional reflexes. "Work has almost completely ceased," Pavlov lamented, and the dark, cold Petrograd winter was approaching. "There are no candles, no kerosene, and electricity is provided only for a limited number of hours. Bad, very bad. When will there be a turn for the better?" In early spring 1918, he expressed his anguish in a poem in prose. "Where are you, freedom, the eternal siren of human beings, from those of beast-like nature to the most complete exemplar of the human spirit? Where are you, genuine, authentic freedom? When will you come and remain with us always? Alas, we are doomed to await you at the end of your long and continuous struggle with your implacable foe, the bridal, your struggle in the family, in society, in the state, in all of humankind, and in our very soul. You will arrive pacified and wonderful only at the very end of this struggle, when you and your rival extend to each other the hand of peace, embrace in friendship, and finally in kinship, as two halves you merge into a single whole. And this moment will be the beginning of the highest human culture, of the highest human happiness. In 3 public lectures that year, he made clear that the central metaphor here underlay and united his basic view of the nervous system, animal and human psychology, and the good life, and he expressed the close relationship between his research on conditional reflexes and his concern with Russia's fate. For Pavlov, authentic freedom was possible only when a person or people correctly perceived reality and acted accordingly. And this, in turn, depended on a lawful and correct balance between excitation, or freedom in the broad sense, and inhibition, or discipline, the bridle. Drawing on his lab experiments, he explained Russia's national tragedy as the result of Russians' chronic imbalance toward excitation, which rendered them incapable of realistic responses to life's demands. This analysis rested on his experiments and a concept that was increasingly attracting his attention: nervous types. Dogs varied greatly, for example, in their ability to differentiate between 2 different speeds of a metronome. The necessary order, measure, and timeliness to correctly differentiate between the 2, and in general to accurately perceive and meet the challenges of the external world, could only be achieved by a balanced interaction between excitation, freedom, and inhibition, discipline. The absence of inhibition and the predominance of excitation produced internal chaos, an uncultured type, lacking correspondence with reality. There existed 2 basic nervous types, Pavlov explained: the even-tempered type, on the one hand, possessing a good balance between excitation and inhibition, performed well in differentiation experiments, and proved itself more perfect and adapted in life. The excitable type, on the other hand, performed poorly in such trials. Insufficiently cultured, it reacts to external phenomena nonsensically. The lack of symmetry in his reasoning is revealing. At this juncture in Russian history, he was clearly unconcerned with an excessively inhibited type. This experimental truth for dogs applied equally to individual humans and peoples, and was clear from the differences between the English and Germans, whose cultures, law, and scientific achievements attested to balance, and the Russians, with their overly indulgent child-rearing, erratically enforced laws, and preference for windy philosophizing over the sober truths of specialists. This chronic problem had taken especially dramatic form in the tragic, calamitous events of our revolutionary time. For Pavlov, the reckless pursuit of the February and October revolutions, despite the obvious threat of an implacable wartime enemy, Trotsky's absurd negotiating stance during the Brest-Litovsk negotiations with Germany, and the dissolution of the empire, all testified to the unrealistic responses of an unbalanced people. The most telling example was Bolshevism itself. While European social democrats rightly sought to protect industrial workers from the abuses of capital, their Russian counterparts pushed this to a grotesque and unrealistic extreme. We have overextended this idea into the dictatorship of the proletariat. We have placed the brain, the head, below, and the feet above. That which constitutes the culture, the intellectual strength of the nation, has been devalued, and that which for now remains a crude force, replaceable by a machine, has been moved to the forefront. All this, of course, is doomed to destruction as a blind rejection of reality. Russia's only hope resided in science. Invoking experiments with Petrova's lab dog, Grizun, Pavlov assured his audience that, after a certain amount of practice, training, the inhibitory process could be improved substantially. Despite all that has occurred, we should not lose hope. He ended his final lecture by reciting his poem, which expressed his vision of the happiness that awaited humanity when excitation, freedom, and inhibition, discipline, were finally integrated and reconciled. "But, gentlemen," he concluded, "I am devoured by torturous doubt. Are such a merger and such happiness possible for the Russian and the Slav in general, or is it impossible?" When the tide of Russia's civil war was turned decisively toward the Red Army in spring 1920, Pavlov sent the Soviet of People's Commissars, Sovnarkom, a pained letter requesting that the state permit him to explore the possibility of emigration. Insurmountable material difficulties of every type, he explained, prevented him from continuing his research in Russia. Furthermore, he was profoundly convinced that the social experiment being conducted on Russia is doomed to certain failure, and that it will yield no result save the political and cultural death of my homeland. This thought oppresses me relentlessly and prevents me from concentrating on my scientific work. Finally, he could not function as a serf, a slave of others, and so refused to surrender to the state control over his work and its rewards. Pavlov did not require permission to communicate with his foreign colleagues. He was already doing so through various channels, or even to leave the country. Perhaps he was simply behaving with characteristic dignity and honesty, or perhaps he was opening negotiations on behalf of himself and Russia's scientific community. Lenin treated his letter as a basis for negotiation. He informed Grigory Zinoviev, head of the Communist Party in Petrograd, that allowing Pavlov to leave would hardly be rational, but that he represents such a great cultural value that he should not be forcibly restrained under conditions of material need. During the Civil War, the Bolsheviks had encouraged Pavlov to emigrate, but now, on the verge of victory, Lenin viewed him as an important member of a scientific community critical to the tasks of socialist construction. A state decree of January 1921 ensured Pavlov a privileged place in Soviet science and society. It charged a special commission with creating most propitious conditions for his living quarters and central lab, awarded him property rights to all sales of his works, and assigned the Pavlovs a food ration twice the normal academician's allotment. Pavlov initially refused the special ration, insisting that he could not enjoy privileges not enjoyed by his colleagues. The state understood his position correctly, not as a rejection of privilege per se, but as a demand for broader assistance to scientists, who were soon provided with state rations, though not so bountiful as Pavlov's. Meanwhile, his inquiries in the West produced disappointing results. His many admiring foreign colleagues collected money to ease his life and sent meat to feed his dogs. They were even willing, perhaps, to support him modestly in such inexpensive locations as Copenhagen, Stockholm, and Helsinki. They did not, however, offer him an academic position, let alone one with the large-scale support required for his style of scientific research. He was, after all, 72 years old, his Nobel Prize-winning work some 20 years behind him, and his conditional reflex research little known in the West. Pavlov had contemplated emigration only under the most extreme conditions, and would certainly not leave Russia for a modest retirement in a foreign culture. His prospects in revolutionary Russia were now much brighter. Stability was returning with the end of the Civil War, and Lenin himself had made clear the state's interest in his work and well-being. By mid-1921, then, Pavlov and the Bolsheviks had reached an accommodation. The state would not permit him to emigrate, but would extend special privileges to him and his labs. This understanding, moreover, had been reached while Pavlov criticized the Bolsheviks roundly and insisted that doing so was a matter of personal honor. Prosperous Dissident, 1921–29. In the 1920s, Pavlov became a prosperous dissident, living a materially comfortable life, presiding over a flourishing, state-funded scientific enterprise, and, protected by his special status, the Communists' most vocal, uncompromising public critic. Yet, the same special status that enabled him to openly criticize Soviet power inevitably changed Pavlov's relations to the Communist Party. To manage his scientific institutions and exploit his privileges for the benefit of himself and others, he had to work constantly with the state apparatus. So, during the 1920s, while consistently hostile to the Bolsheviks in general, Pavlov developed a smooth working relationship with various central ministries, the Leningrad Party, and two important communists, Lev Fedorov and Nikolai Bukharin. Fedorov had taught experimental psychology and served as political commissar at Tomsk University before the Sovnarkom assigned him in mid-1923 to Pavlov's lab at the IEM. His tasks were to monitor Pavlov and facilitate his research while organizing a communist presence at the country's leading medical investigative institution. Over the next few years, he became an important party apparatchik, while also impressing Pavlov with his dedication and talent for research and management. With Pavlov's support, Fedorov became assistant director of the IEM and editor of the country's leading physiological journal. In 1931, he became the IEM's first communist director and rose to national prominence, advising Stalin on important scientific medical matters. Pavlov knew that Fedorov was handling him for the party, but his attitude toward him was respectful and even friendly. State largesse restored Pavlov's labs to life by mid-1921. The renovated facilities were staffed by a new, much-expanded workforce, many of whose members were attracted by the great prestige of science in Soviet society and by Pavlov's growing reputation. He abandoned one of his three labs when he resigned from the Military Medical Academy in 1924 to protest its purge of students from clerical families. But that loss was more than compensated by the expansion of his labs at the Academy of Sciences, which now became a physiological institute, and the IEM, with its new Tower of Silence. Encased in fortress-like walls and vibration-proof floors, the tower's high-tech chambers enabled experimenters to conduct trials from outside the room and isolated the dog in an ostensibly neutral environment. All this produced Pavlov's first recorded, albeit backhanded, compliment for the Bolsheviks. Chatting with his co-workers upon returning from a short trip to Paris in 1926, he commented on the poverty of French labs, and, after a brief reflective pause, added, "Yes, you must give our barbarians one thing. They understand the value of science." His relationship with Bukharin evolved over the years. Praised by Lenin as the darling of the party, Bukharin was, in 1924, a leading theorist and member of the Central Committee when Pavlov devoted the first lecture of his course on physiology to a denunciation of Bukharin's proletarian revolution and culture. He began, "I was, am, and will remain a Russian person, a son of the homeland. I am most of all interested in its life. I live by its interests. Its moral dignity fortifies my own. I was not a little surprised when history placed before me the question, would my homeland be or not be? The very thought that my homeland will perish would deprive me completely of the basic sense of my scientific activity. For whom, then, would I strive? I live with two thoughts. On the one hand, with thoughts about physiology, and on the other, what will come of my homeland? What awaits my homeland? To what end is all this leading?" Lacerating Bolshevik policies, especially towards science, he accused them of betraying Russia's welfare in pursuit of fantasies about world revolution, and excoriated Bukharin's pledge to abolish the anarchy of cultural intellectual production through the same planning principles employed to produce textiles and sausage. Pavlov's public criticisms made him a national symbol of political resistance. One widespread rumor, encouraged by his protests against the persecution of religion, held, falsely, that he was himself a religious believer. He also loudly denounced the campaign of intimidation in 1928-29 that cowed members of the Academy of Sciences into electing unqualified communist sympathizers and, as Pavlov put it, terrorists. Among those new terrorist academicians was Bukharin, who by this time had lost much of his power in his losing struggle with Stalin. Bukharin believed that Pavlov's worldview provided ample common ground for a conciliatory approach, replying to one member of Stalin's faction that I know he does not sing the Internationale, but he is the world's leading physiologist, a materialist, and, despite all his grumbling, ideologically he is working for us. A leading advocate of détente with the bourgeois intelligentsia, Bukharin was instructed to befriend Pavlov. He began to do so effectively in 1928-29, breaking the ice by demonstrating his erudition, and especially his knowledge of butterflies. Pavlov had been an avid collector, and gradually convincing the scientist that he too sought a more democratic and humane state. As their relationship matured, Pavlov came to identify Bukharin with his hope for the moderation of Bolshevism, and spoke of him with great regard. Here was an intelligent communist, learned and humane, but an unrealistic dreamer. "I'd like to have him in our dog stand for a few years," Pavlov once remarked. "We would teach him to correctly reflect actual reality." In December 1929, Pavlov turned a celebration of the 100th anniversary of Ivan Sechenov's birth into a startling political spectacle. Asked to introduce the program with a few words, he strode dramatically toward a large portrait of the father of Russian physiology and addressed it. "O noble and stern apparition! How you would have suffered if in living human form you still remained among us! We live under the rule of cruel principle that the state and authority are everything, that the person, the citizen, is nothing. Life, freedom, dignity, convictions, beliefs, habits, the possibility of studying, means for life, food, housing, clothing, everything is in the hands of the government. For the average citizen, there is only unquestioning obedience. Naturally, gentlemen, the entire citizenry is transformed into a quivering, slavish mass. On such a basis, gentlemen, not only can no civilized state be built, but no state at all can long survive." He was not granted a public forum again for more than 5 years. Contradictory sentiments. 1930-36. During the 1930s, Pavlov's opinion of and relationship with the Bolsheviks changed gradually, and by 1934-36, qualitatively. Having earlier regarded the Soviet state as an unrealistic and impermanent terrorist regime, he came to view it as his country's government, with a mixed record of ongoing crimes, blunders, and important achievements. The seemingly contradictory direction of Soviet policy in 1933-36 was, even for those who understood Stalinism much better than Pavlov, difficult to evaluate. On the one hand, especially after the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, there were signs of moderation, the more reasonable Second Five-Year Plan, and the end of rationing, the loosening of ideological controls in many fields, Bukharin's return to political eminence, though not power, and the promise of a new constitution that would guarantee a secret ballot and other basic democratic rights. On the other hand, in the 3 months after Leningrad Party chief Sergei Kirov's assassination in December 1934, thousands of Leningraders were swept up by the Quiet Terror. The same fundamental elements of Pavlov's pre-revolutionary worldview that had earlier set him against the Bolsheviks, his scientism and state patriotism, militated in the 1930s toward a rapprochement with them. Pavlov had believed since the 1860s that the growth and cultural impact of scientific knowledge was a sure guarantor of social progress. In the USSR, the number of institutions and cadres was increasing at a remarkable rate, and science enjoyed unprecedented cultural prestige. He was also impressed by his communist co-workers, whom he often scolded about party policy, but valued for their dedication and, in some cases, as thinking people in their research. The inevitable consequences of scientific literacy, for Pavlov, were profound. If Soviet youth took their science seriously, he informed students in one lecture, they would abandon communist doctrine, because science and dogmatism are completely incompatible. In that same spirit, he confidently informed one communist official that whatever new people the authorities promote, if they are not stupid and become educated in the full meaning of that term, they cannot but sooner or later recognize the right of freedom of thought. Scientific culture would eventually bring with it realism and balance, and so reasonable, humane, democratic policies. This scientific faith encouraged him to look for promising signs during a confusing time in which such signs, like patterns in experimental results, could certainly be discerned. So, for example, he opened a gathering of his co-workers in February 1935 with these hopeful words: "I have complained many times about the oppressiveness of life. Now I want to say something different. It seems to me that our life is changing for the better." The hopeful signs, the swallows of spring, were the end of rationing and the promise of a secret ballot. I want to believe that there is really occurring a turn toward a normal structure of life. Pavlov was also preoccupied by the threats of Japanese militarism and especially Nazism. So, as when Tsarist Russia entered the World War, he was profoundly inclined to support his country's government. Shortly after the Nazi seizure of power, a provincial scientist who had enjoyed swapping anti-Soviet jokes with Pavlov in the 1920s discovered that things had changed when he shared a new one with the chief. "It is a scoundrel," Pavlov snapped, "who undermines his government when the homeland is in danger." Pavlov's working relationship with the state apparatus also gradually accustomed him to insider attitudes. Railing publicly against Soviet power accomplished little, but he could sometimes do some good by using his connections. At the same time, he was also subject to constant surveillance in the lab, on the street, and at home with his family. The authorities used the information gathered to manipulate him, often acting through Pavlov's intimates, especially Petrova and his son Vladimir, who, motivated by some combination of fear and conviction, could be counted on to intervene at key moments on the party's behalf. For Pavlov, the 1930s were also years of unparalleled privilege and prosperity. When he complained that noisy traffic outside the IEM disturbed his dogs, the offending street was moved. When he fell ill and a physician prescribed foreign champagne, it arrived the next day from Helsinki. And when he wanted more space for his physiological institute at the Academy of Sciences, the president of the academy was ousted from his neighboring quarters. The USSR's most famous scientist was served by a chauffeured Lincoln, though he usually preferred to walk, and his pantry regularly supplied with imported food. Most moving for Pavlov was the construction of a massive new research center, the Institute of Experimental Genetics of Higher Nervous Activity, in the town of Koltushi, outside Leningrad. A decree of 1929 celebrated his 80th birthday with massive funding for this new facility. Another, in 1934, marked his 85th with even more lavish support. State largesse created a science village, supplied by its own collective farm, that became a symbol of Soviet science and a second home for an aging scientist with a taste for life in the countryside. This project also brought Pavlov into regular contact with Vyacheslav Molotov, chair of the Sovnarkom and Stalin's closest associate, and with Grigory Kaminsky, commissar of public health. His profound sense of moral obligation to repay the Russian people and Soviet state for this fulsome support also created an emotional bond with the government. Although he ceased criticizing the government publicly, and with foreign colleagues, even privately, Pavlov continued to do so trenchantly in private conversation, comments to co-workers, and outraged letters to communist leaders. In one particularly eloquent letter to Molotov in December 1934, he wrote that it is difficult, sometimes very difficult, to live here. The attempt to build a new type of society was grandiose in its courage, yet it was only an experiment, and like every experiment, its final result remained unknown. Moreover, this experiment is terribly expensive. with the extermination of all cultural peace and all the cultural beauty of life. We have lived and are living under an unrelenting regime of terror and violence. For man, having come from the beast, to descend is easy, but to ascend is difficult. Those who maliciously sentence to death masses of their own kind and do so with satisfaction, like those who are forced to participate in it, can hardly remain beings who feel and think in a human way. And the reverse. Those who are transformed into beaten animals can hardly become beings with a sense of their own human moral dignity. Have mercy on our homeland and on us. Molotov passed the letter to Stalin with the comment, "A new nonsensical letter from academician Pavlov." Defying official campaigns against the church, Pavlov closed his labs and discontinued his Wednesday conferences during Easter and Christmas. At Koltushi, the Pavlovs marked Christmas with a traditional tree and attended Easter services and supported the beleaguered church morally and financially. He rejected every attempt by the state to intervene in his own labs. In 1933, when a militant from the section of scientific workers arrived at his physiological institute and announced his assignment to purge it of undesirables, Pavlov shouted, "Get out, bastard!" grabbed him by the collar, kneed him in the back, and chased him down the stairs and out the door. When the section informed Leningrad Party Chief Sergei Kirov of this outrage, he responded, bearing in mind Pavlov's special status, that, "I can't help you." He used that special status to save many victims from the terror. Some were from his personal and scientific circle, including Stanislav Vyrshikovsky, the first director of Koltushi, Nikolai Krasnogorsky, a longtime favorite who managed Pavlov's nervous clinic at the IEM, and two valued communist co-workers, Peter Denisov and Fyodor Mayorov, as well as members of co-workers' families. He won the release of A.I. Barkatova, the woman who cleaned the kennels at the Physiological Institute, by insisting that she was critical to his research. Countless desperate others camped outside his apartment or appealed to his son and official secretary, Vsevolod. There were many such matters, Vsevolod's wife later recalled, and her husband frequently returned home in a state of moral exhaustion. Pavlov suffered guilt and heart palpitations. He was then hardly unknowing or uncaring about Stalinist crimes. Yet his general perspective and attitude had changed, as would soon be evident on the world stage. For years, communist officials had sought Pavlov's support for holding the International Congress of Physiology in Russia. He had refused in 1926 and 1929, fearing that Russia would be embarrassed by rejection of its invitation, or, much worse, by the poor conditions that visiting delegates would encounter. In 1932, he consented, now confident that the invitation would be accepted. The state would organize the event successfully, and Russia's new scientific cadres and facilities, including his own at Koltushi, would make a good impression. The Congress that transpired in Leningrad and Moscow in August 1935 would provide the dramatic centerpiece of Pavlov's final year. Chapter 6. Nervous Types. Pavlov's dogs were recognizable individuals who lived for years in the lab, displaying full-blown personalities that became an integral part of lab culture, a constant factor in the interpretation of experimental results, and the theme of a central, integrative line of investigation. The chief and his collaborators routinely described their canine co-workers as weak or strong, lethargic or active, obtuse or intelligent, compliant or independent, passive or impressionable, aloof or sociable, modest or greedy, cowardly or heroic. Co-worker Rita Wright-Kovaleva described her Bess as plodding and unimaginative, but a good worker. Undistracted by extraneous noises and movements, this proletarian animal formed conditional reflexes, CRs, slowly, But his hard-won knowledge proved solid and lasting. Her other dog, the scholarly Toy, was easily distracted, and if not challenged with demanding work, even fell asleep, bored, on the stand. Yet, once engaged, Toy easily outpaced the workmanlike Bess. When studying digestion, Pavlov had pronounced the dog almost a participant in the experiments conducted upon it. In CR research, there was no almost about it. Lab animals were not experimented upon. Rather, they worked. Some worked well, others poorly. Some tasks put before the dog during its workday, such as forming a delayed CR to electrical shock, were so extremely demanding that only a noteworthy few proved capable of them. Dogs responded differently to the sacrifice of their freedom for the restraint of the experimental stand, and some bridled at their working conditions, refusing, for example, to cooperate with a new coworker or labor in the isolated chambers of the Tower of Silence. They could be hurt or even broken by the burdens of work or life in general, by an overly taxing task, a fight in the kennel, or the loss of a sexual partner. Sometimes an experience on the stand or with another dog elicited an unexpected reaction, exposing a deep wound from its pre-lab life. Burdened beyond endurance, it might whine, refuse to eat or work, behave in an uncharacteristically timid or aggressive manner, or present symptoms of mental illness. The quality of a dog's work and personality was very important for its human collaborator. Particularly intriguing results might attract Pavlov to the bench, leading to a close collaboration. Enthusiastic reports about the co-workers' labors during the lab's regular and spontaneous gatherings, mention in Pavlov's talks and publications, and perhaps a lab or professorship of one's own. It was only fitting, then, that co-workers were frequently photographed with their dogs, and in 1926 marked the 25th anniversary of Pavlov's CR research with a jocular greeting from his canine scientific collaborators. The following year, they presented him with a photo album of 40 currently employed dogs with a list, but no photos, of each animal's current human partner. During the first decade of CR research, co-workers frequently observed that different dogs responded differently to identical experiments. By 1918, several tentative typologies had emerged, and in the 1920s and 1930s, investigation of nervous types was central to lab research. The task was to explain the differing results of CR experiments and to map these on the dog's varying behaviors and personalities. Thus, the physiological would be fused with the psychological, and both would be rendered pravilnie. This was, to say the least, a very ambitious endeavor. As Pavlov devoted to it more co-workers, dogs, and experimental trials, the data became increasingly discordant, and their relationship to personality and behavior increasingly difficult to divine. Conceptualizing his canine collaborators as an animal or person in nature and society, he constantly introduced plausible new variables, the onset of mental illness and the interplay of nature-nurture, for example, that might deliver that wonderful moment when suddenly everything becomes clear. But more data just compounded the problem. The doctrine of nervous types became more far-reaching, but also less precise, less refutable, less pravilnie. Here, we explore this history through 3 episodes of the 1920s. Postrel, Milord, and Freud's Anna O. In mid-1922, intent on explaining the divergent results in identical experiments on different dogs, Pavlov joined Maria Petrova in their semi-private experimental quarters on the 2nd floor of the Tower of Silence to launch a 3-year comparative study of 2 dogs, Postrel and Milord, whose personalities and performance in experiments differed markedly. The older Milord was solid, balanced, and peaceful. The younger Postrel was very lively and active. Petrova and Pavlov first established that the dog's personalities matched their salivary patterns in experiments establishing CRs to 6 stimuli. Milord efficiently formed the 6 CRs, and also the more difficult delayed reflex to each. A successful delayed CR manifested the standard salivary response to a stimulus, but only after a time lag, and this, according to lab doctrine, required a balance of excitation and inhibition. Milord enjoyed exercising that balance, afterward becoming livelier in appearance and eating with gusto. The sprightly postural formed the CRs even more quickly, but proved inferior at differentiation and delayed reflexes. The confrontation of excitatory and inhibitory processes involved in those tasks proved so trying that he fell into such an irritated state and such a fury that further work was impossible. Having established that their dogs differed in nervous type, Pavlov and Petrova decided to test what happened when this collision of excitation and inhibition was taken to the extreme, to the point of a break. This turn reflected Pavlov's long-standing interest in psychiatry. In the 1890s, probably inspired by his family history, his own morbid spontaneous paroxysms, and his bouts, and those of his friends, with neurasthenia and hysteria in the 1870s and 1880s, Pavlov had begun regularly to make the rounds with clinicians at the Alexander III Home for the Care of the Mentally Ill, where his friend Alexander Timofeev was director. During Russia's Civil War, when experimental research ground to a halt, he often skied to the home, and in an article on psychiatry as a partner of the physiology of the cerebral hemispheres, 1919, he compared some of its patients with the lab dog Norka. He later attributed the idea of breaking Postural and Milord to the influence of Sigmund Freud's analysis of the landmark case of Anna O. Generally critical of Freudian theory, Pavlov credited the founder of psychoanalysis with important insights that, like those of physicians in general, required the undergirding of a truly scientific, physiological analysis. As he put it to American co-worker Horsley Gant, "We cannot ascribe all of his ideas to fantasy. There is much truth in what he says, and this is because it is based on physiology. He makes the mistake of considering himself a psychiatrist instead of a physiologist, and he uses psychological terminology. There is much reality in what he has to say about the collisions and inhibitions in the brain." Reminiscing years later, Pavlov explicitly identified Freud as his inspiration to produce neuroses in dogs by means of collisions. The stenographic account renders his remarks in the third person. In one of his early works, Freud described a case of neurosis in a woman who had for many years needed to care for her sick, fatally ill father, whom she loved very much, and who had suffered terribly from the expectation of his inevitable death, attempting all the while to appear happy to him, hiding from him the seriousness of his illness. Through psychoanalysis, Freud established that this lay at the basis of the neurosis that developed later. Viewing this as the difficult confrontation of the processes of inhibition and excitation, Ivan Petrovich immediately proposed using this same difficult confrontation of two opposing processes as the fundamental method for eliciting experimental neuroses in dogs. Freud had used the case of Anna O. in Studies on Hysteria, 1895, to illustrate his view that hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences, and to promote the talking cure. His analysis featured psychic forces that conflicted, combined, and inhibited one another, and he sought to explicate the dynamics of these processes while remaining agnostic about their ultimate nature. Pavlov identified Freud's conflicting psychical actors as his own fundamental nervous forces, excitation and inhibition. Anna O's hysteria resulted from the conflict between the powerful excitatory impulse of her grief and the strong inhibitory impulse of her determination to hide that grief from her father. The physiological basis of these emotions was identical in humans and dogs, Pavlov reasoned, so he should be able to reproduce this same conflict in Pastrol and Milord. The experimenters did so by using the same procedure as had Erofiva a decade earlier, by feeding the hungry dog only in association with an electrical shock, that is, establishing shock as a conditional stimulus, CS. This, they reasoned, created a clash between excitatory and inhibitory impulses in the dog's nervous systems. When the animal began to salivate in response to shock, Petrova increased its intensity to increase the severity of that clash, and so subject Milord and Pastrol to the same basic plight as Freud's Anna O. Each dog eventually broke, but in a different direction. Pastrol's reflexes lost their regular character, and experiments showed that his inhibitory process, previously weak, was shattered, leaving him pathologically overexcitable. The better-balanced Milord proved more resilient, continuing to salivate at ever higher levels of shock, but he too eventually broke in the direction of inhibition. The dogs now suffered two different neuroses corresponding to the differences in their nervous system. Having rendered their dogs neurotic, the experimenters attempted to cure them. Drawing on her clinical experience, Petrova rested and then treated them with bromide salts, in light of its indubitable action in the treatment of several nervous illnesses in people. Pavlov had himself been treated with bromides during his bouts with neurasthenia and hysteria. Milord did not respond to either therapy and was retired from experimental practice. Pastrol, on the other hand, responded well. The dog's ability to differentiate was restored, and his conditional inhibitors now elicited a satisfyingly perfect 0 drops of saliva. That cure, however, proved short-lived. It now became standard lab procedure to analyze dogs' nervous type, and psychiatric concepts came to play an increasingly important role in the interpretation of experimental results. One result was the reinterpretation of Erofiva's much ballyhooed experimental trials of 1911-12. Earlier, her dog's salivation to a combination of food and electrical shock had led Pavlov to equate them with the Christian martyrs who, inspired by love of God, had borne their torture with a smile. Now, they were re-diagnosed as broken, mentally ill. August, the flood, and the physiology of cowardice. On September 24, 1924, a catastrophic flood inundated Leningrad, washing over the grounds of Pavlov's lab at the IEM, where some 100 dogs were soon pressed against the wire ceilings of their kennel, straining to keep their noses above the rising waters. Co-workers rescued them by swimming into the cages, grabbing the terrified animals by the head, forcing them underwater, guiding them to safety through the submerged cage door, and ferrying them to the safety of a distant building. The rescuers noticed that the animals at this time completely changed their usual behavior. They huddled close to people and to each other. Many wailed loudly, and even the most aggressive among them did not provoke fights, but rather were obedient. Even dogs that had been praised for their stronger nervous organization were much distressed, but all were saved. Among the survivors was August, described by co-worker Alexander Speransky as a very lively, mobile, greedy dog, distinguished by submissiveness and cowardice. For example, if Speransky shouted, clapped his hands, or moved suddenly, August would wag his tail, squat on the floor, and urinate. August had nevertheless proved a good experimental animal, developing healthy CRs to 6 stimuli and performing differentiations successfully. When experiments resumed 1 week after the flood, however, his CRs had disappeared, and he responded to the feedback with a clearly negative movement reaction, that is, fearfully. Over the next few days, Speransky monitored the dog's health and instructed attendants not to feed him off the stand. Yet the strange behavior persisted. Pavlov now joined Speransky, and noticed that the dog's affect changed when alone. Peacefully occupying the stand when his master was present, August panted and moved fitfully upon his departure. Exposure to a CS exacerbated this response. When Speransky remained in the room while Pavlov conducted experiments from outside, August approached and ate from the feed bag normally and responded to most CSs as he had before the flood. His reaction to the buzzer, however, showed that he had not recovered. The dog suddenly hopped to his feet and began to fitfully move upon the stand and howl. When the buzzer ceased, he exhibited a passive-defensive reaction and responded weakly to all CSs. The experimenters then used Speransky's presence in the room to reverse this, weaning the dog off this social factor by gradually replacing the coworker with components of his presence, for example, his jacket. August now responded even to the buzzer with levels of salivation that approximated pre-flood levels, although the data revealed some continuing pathology. Hypothesizing that August's peculiar reactions resulted from the trauma of the flood, Pavlov and Speransky prepared a decisive experiment. A buzzer was sounded to recreate the alarms of that day, and a hose noisily flooded August's experimental chamber. The dog tossed about against the straps, whined, and strained against the stand. And after this he did not eat, gave no reflexes whatsoever. In a word, he broke. Speransky then began applying August's CSs. The animal responded only by panting and twisting in the stand. Every attempt to restore his CRs failed, eliciting various hypnotic phases intermediate between wakefulness and sleep. The experimenters diagnosed August with traumatic neurosis, or fear neurosis, elicited by a sharp disturbance of the balance of excitation and inhibition. Only a few of the dogs subjected to the flood manifested this neurosis, which testified to the importance of inborn constitution. It made good sense that August, a dog with a sharply expressed passive-defensive reflex and characterized by exaggerated inhibitory processes, had responded by breaking in the direction of inhibition. The combination of constitution and experience had rendered him neurotic. In a speech to the Parisian Society of Psychologists in December 1925, Pavlov used August's ordeal to demonstrate the power of CR methodology to illuminate psychological subjects and to propose a classification of nervous types that joined his research to Western medicine's most ancient tradition. The dogs in his lab displayed a great range of behaviors and personalities, which had long made it difficult to completely reproduce our facts in different animals. When grouped by nervous type, however, these varied results fell into place, corresponding to differences in behavior and personality. Using August as his model, Pavlov explained the behavior, personality, and performance in CR experiments of cowardly dogs as a result of the predominance of inhibition over excitation. The relative weakness of the latter process was probably rooted in the dog's cortical cells, which contained either an inadequate supply of excitatory material or low-quality material that was easily consumed. An excitatory stimulus, then, quickly exhausted such dogs' excitatory capacity, eliciting an inhibitory impulse that protected the cells from damage. August's salivary responses during experiments closely mirrored his behavior and psychological character. When his CRs diminished, the dog also responded to food, not by approaching it to eat, but rather with a passive-defensive, fearful response. Clearly, at the foundation of normal timidity and cowardice, and especially pathological phobias, lies the simple predominance of the physiological process of inhibition as an expression of the weakness of the cortical cells. Surveying the dogs in his labs, Pavlov claimed that they corresponded to the classical Hippocratic types. For the Hippocratic physician, each constitutional type, sanguinic, melancholic, phlegmatic, and choleric, resulted from a particular combination of humors, blood, black bile, phlegm, yellow bile, and had its own recognizable predispositions and personality. When the combination of constitution, environment, and way of life gave rise to humoral imbalances, this resulted in poor health, which the physician rectified through bleeding, purging, and regimen. For Pavlov, the connection between his experimental physiology and ancient medical wisdom, like that between his digestive research and physicians' emphasis on appetite, demonstrated the truth of his research and its ability to explain the scientific basis of time-honored empirical wisdom. Pavlov claimed that his findings fit the Hippocratic typology especially well for the two extreme types, the sanguinic and the melancholic. Postrel served as a model sanguinic, and August as melancholic. Is it not natural to consider and name him melancholic if at every step, at every moment, the surroundings elicit in him always the very same relentless, passive defensive reflex? Between these two types were two variants of the balanced type, presumably the phlegmatic and choleric. In each, the excitatory and inhibitory processes were of adequate strength and interacted in a precise and timely fashion. He offered neither examples nor elaboration. In his 1927 monograph, Pavlov observed that these intermediary types were better adapted to the natural conditions of life and therefore biologically more resistant, and conceded that a large number of animals cannot be placed definitely in any of the four types. Returning with Petrova to the Tower of Silence, he experimented on several such animals, chosen again for their behavior and affect, which led to the introduction of a third variable. Aside from tending toward either excitation or inhibition, dogs and people could be relatively balanced or unbalanced. This brought Pavlov fully into sync with the Hippocratic foursome. The choleric was unbalanced and excitable, the sanguinic excitable but fairly balanced, the phlegmatic tended toward inhibition but was fairly balanced, and the melancholic was unbalanced and inhibited. This new schema, however, required re-diagnosis of particular dogs. The excitable, unbalanced postrel was now typed as choleric, replaced as model sanguinic by two dogs, including the Napoleonic type, Pingle, who were excitable but too well balanced to be broken. This typology served Pavlov well in brief presentations and became a staple of news coverage when he became internationally famous in the 1920s. But, as he well knew, it hardly explained the great variation in experimental results and personalities, or the relationship between the two, among his experimental animals. Recognizing that the life experiences of both lab dogs and humans were endlessly complex, he continued to explore new variables toward that fine day when CR data and personality would all fall into place. Garsick, Nature, Nurture, and Pavlov's Autobiographical Insight. Addressing London's Royal Society in 1928, Pavlov expressed the hope that his research would inform people's upbringing and self-education. I, for one, while looking at these experiments, have understood much both in myself and in others. He was alluding to ongoing studies of a puzzling group of experimental animals that were complicating his typology with yet another variable, and in so doing, resolving a long-standing mystery about himself. These were dogs whose performance in CR experiments clearly did not match their personality traits. That led Pavlov to emphasize the plasticity of the nervous system, to investigate the influence of life experience and training, and to distinguish between inborn temperament and the mature character that resulted from the interaction of nature and nurture. One such investigation was conducted by co-worker Nikolai Vinogradov with Umnitsa, another weak, inhibited type who, like August, had worked well on the experimental stand until the flood left her unable to produce consistent CRs. Vinogradov's experiments highlighted the importance of two dimensions of higher nervous activity that were acquiring increasing recognition: the role of experience, or training, and that of the social exciter. As a result of Umnitsa's weak nervous system and associations with the flood, she could not initially form a CR to the electrical buzzer, which elicited an immobilizing passive-defensive reflex. So Vinogradov muffled the buzzer, developed in the dog a CR to this gentler, less alarming stimulus, and gradually worked up to and achieved a CR to the buzzer at full strength. That same approach enabled him to extend the length and intensity of Umnitsa's workday. Vinogradov also noticed that the dog performed poorly in an isolated chamber, but could work longer and respond more precisely in the constant, friendly presence of the experimenter master. The social exciter, he and Pavlov concluded, raised the general tonus of the higher nervous system, which was particularly salutary for weak nervous types. Vinogradov's techniques were used to heal the shattered inhibitory processes of postural, broken earlier by Pavlov and Petrova, reviving the animal's lab career and necessitating another re-diagnosis of his nervous type. In the 1930s, Pavlov thrilled to Postural's achievements in experiments, regaling co-workers with regular reports about this previously underestimated hero with the nerves of a knight. Two studies of cowardly dogs further complicated the relationship between dogs' performance in CR experiments and their behavioral and personality attributes. Dmitry Kuimov's dog, Felix, was cowardly and submissive, yet performed marvelously in the stand, differentiating easily between the metronome at two different speeds, which was achievable only by those with a balanced nervous system. How, then, to explain the animal's cowardice? This, Kuimov concluded, no doubt at the suggestion of the chief, who was observing his experiments, was probably the result of the dog's earlier training. Felix's clipped tail, they reasoned, testified to his former master's hope that he would become a show dog. That pampered status had spared him the interactions with other dogs and rigorous demands from humans that might have toughened him up to the level his inborn qualities made possible. Alexander Ivanov Smolensky's dog, Garsik, seemed similarly paradoxical. He shrank fearfully at the approach of a dog or human, and so seemed an inhibited type with a weak cerebral cortex. Yet he formed both positive and negative CRs quickly, accomplished delayed reflexes easily, and emerged unscathed from experimental challenges that broke weak dogs. Intrigued, Pavlov worked closely with his co-worker on Garsik's case, and they concluded that these contradictory indications resulted from the animal's upbringing. Garsik had been born and raised in the lab's kennel, that is, in conditions of unfreedom, in a jailhouse regime which had encouraged caution, broken his spirit, and produced submissive behaviors that masked his true nervous character. Here again, the mapping of experimental results on observable behaviors and personalities required another variable: the animal's life experiences. Garsik inspired the chief to create in Koltushi a center for the study of the nature-nurture relationship. Pavlov was preoccupied with Garsik in 1928 when he confided to his distinguished London audience that experiments on nervous types had illuminated much about myself. He clearly identified with the dog's divergence between inborn temperament and mature character, as Pavlov must have considered himself an unlikely nervous type to become a successful scientist. As we have heard, he believed that only a firm balance between excitation and inhibition allowed an organism to differentiate precisely between similar stimuli, and, generally, to perceive reality correctly. That same balance, he had explained in his impassioned, pained speeches of 1918, was the physiological basis for the great realism of the English and German types, and so for their successes in the culture of daily life, self-government, and science, while the imbalance of the Russian type, the predominance of excitation, underlay his homeland's woeful performance in those same spheres. Yet Pavlov himself was hardly a strong, balanced type. Famously explosive, he described himself as an unrestrained choleric and a cycloid, a cyclically unbalanced strong type. He was perhaps describing his own feelings during his legendary outbursts when he stated confidently that if an overexcitable dog could speak, it would report that it cannot restrain itself from doing what it should not. How, then, could this unbalanced choleric become such a successful scientist? At the turn of the century, Pavlov had enjoyed discussing his scientific style in terms of the German chemist and philosopher Wilhelm Ostwald's classification of thinkers as romantics or classicists. By the 1920s, he naturally employed instead the framework of nervous types. Pavlov's longtime associate, Josef Rosenthal, was no doubt drawing on such discussions when, in an article for Physician's Gazette on the occasion of Pavlov's 80th birthday in 1929, he analyzed the chief's nervous type. Pavlov's difficult life before 1890 had developed in him strong self-control that balanced his inborn excitability. The result was a personality possessing both powerful excitatory and inhibitory processes. This was the physiological basis of Pavlov's scientific style, which combined a powerful excitatory phase, featuring free and even fantastic theorizing, with an equally powerful inhibitory phase, with all-sided critical analysis of hypotheses. Devoted to Pavlov and intimately familiar with his temper, Rosenthal would never have published such a revelation, let alone in a celebratory article, without approval from the chief himself. Pavlov's abilities and achievements, like Garsik's then, resulted from the interaction of heredity and life experience. His elliptical comment in London about enhanced self-knowledge referred to this resolution of an autobiographical riddle through his anthropomorphic and often self-referential experimental research on animals. Chasing the Horizon. Recognizing the importance of life experience immeasurably complicated the definition of nervous types, and this at a time when the state was investing enormous sums to build Pavlov's science village at Koltushi, where the central goal of investigating nature-nurture and breeding pure nervous types required a precise and reliable typology. In November 1930, Pavlov announced to his co-workers that another grand revision was necessary. He had been mistaken to think that excitable types are specialists at excitation but bad at inhibition, and inhibitory types the reverse. For example, Postrel, who had earlier exemplified the excitable type, had since demonstrated the ability, with sufficient training, to develop very strong inhibition. So, Pavlov abandoned the 4 Hippocratic types based on the relative strength of excitation and inhibition, and instead proposed the qualities of strength, balance, and lability. Nerve cells, he explained, have 2 basic qualities: the ability to perform work and lability, to switch responses quickly, the opposite of inertia. Dogs with strong excitatory processes might also have strong inhibitory processes. Their relative balance and lability were separate, independent qualities. He pondered the situation privately and unhappily. Titling a single sheet of paper, "Possible Types of Central Nervous System," he began combining systematically the 3 qualities that influenced a dog's responses to an experiment, and so defined its nervous type, sometimes provisionally identifying these combinations with a particular dog. He began: 1. Strong, balanced, labile. 2. Strong, balanced, inert excitation and inhibition. 3. Strong, balanced, inert excitation, labile inhibition. 4. Strong, balanced, inert inhibition, labile excitation. 5. Strong, unbalanced with a relative dominance of excitation, labile. 6. Strong, unbalanced with a relative dominance of excitation, inert excitation, and inhibition. Working out the various combinations, he listed 12 possible strong types before reaching 13, weak, balanced, labile, passive-defensive, and delineating 12 possible varieties of weak dogs, identifying one of the lab's notable cowards provisionally within one of these. 22. Weak, relative dominance of inhibition, inert excitation and inhibition. Umnitsa? Then came 25. Middling, balanced, labile. But now headed for at least 36 possible types, and with very few of his 150 dogs included in with any of them, he ended his list with the desultory recognition, and so forth. His journey to the horizon continued.